going to go ahead and start, although Jill is missing. Tonight our primary goal, guys, is to welcome Chris Leopold and Nikki South, and so I'll introduce them in a second. They're going to review with us the current articles of agreement that we've been talking about, and how Vernon does not or does fit into that process, for our consideration of whether that is a merger we want to consider moving forward after the last couple of months of a little bit of chaos. So let's go ahead first and get some business out of the way before I introduce them. I also want to open it up to the public. I'm going to do what we usually do, is open it up to the public at the beginning and then at the end, and we tend to run late with that. Tonight is an unusual situation. We're meeting at 5 because there's a rewards ceremony here at 7, so we're definitely going to be over by 7 so that people can attend that. Ideally, I think we stop at like 5 of 7 so you get down there in time. Ron has to leave by 6:45. Okay, so we're going to be pretty attentive to the time. So I've established the outcomes, that this is an exchange we're learning from our legal counsel. I do ask that folks in the public to, if you have questions, they should come at the end. Often, sometimes people jump in. Please do not jump in. You won't be recognized. So let's all be respectful of that process. Let's go ahead and approve the minutes. Everyone has read them, but I assume?
Yeah.
Is there?
I'll move the minutes of May 26th.
Second. Okay. Any discussion? All those. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
phrasing my, there was a line in there, unfortunately my printer didn't work, so I don't have it right in front of me.
Yeah.
But, oh, thank you. There was a line in here towards the end, concerns or ideas. I didn't actually remember this. I'm sure it happened and I didn't catch it at the time. I just wanted to comment on it's unwise to base decisions on predictions of the new legislative/political landscape. Act 46 will not be repealed. I don't think anyone was really talking about Act 46 being repealed, but the fact that a different governor and different governor's appointees may have very different interpretations of what is a fairly open-ended law, and use open-ended terms like equity, which could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So that's just a note on that line that I
make a suggestion for language for.
I do remember Mike saying something about that it wouldn't be repealed.
Yep.
In the conversation.
Okay.
Yep. Just when he was talking.
We're talking about Mike Hebert?
Yes, Mike
Okay.
Hebert said something about that.
Okay, so you have a memory of that. Are you comfortable with that?
It was a
position?
passing comment, Ian. It wasn't, he was talking about
okay,
the
so
change
could
of
we
government
word
and
that
how.
as a quote from Mike Hebert?
I mean, he
I
said it.
don't even know where this is in the
Write down
minutes.
his exact words, you know.
Okay. Mike Hebert in attendance indicated that
Yeah.
Act 46 will not be repealed.
I mean, we've heard the same thing from Secretary Holt.
Yeah, no, my concern is just that makes a finite concept out of
Well, it does say on there,
Fine,
thoughts,
issue.
concerns, and ideas.
Yes,
But
but that's what it is, that's what those are. That's what those are. I don't think it should be in quotes. So, I mean, these were study committee members' thoughts, concerns, and or ideas, and I was making a list. I wasn't necessarily trying to assign them to a
right.
particular person or persons because there were multiple people thinking all the same thing and making similar comments. So I was
Okay.
looking for common threads. If you'd like Ian to offer a suggestion, I'm open to it. But that was the takeaway.
well, it's not a huge deal.
Well, was the thread that, but there may be changes with different, I think the takeaway, what you're saying was the takeaway was, but there may be tweaks down the road or something, or legislative tweaks or different tweaks under different government.
Yeah. But in the note, that this is just notes from individuals.
I do the same thing with comments from the public, you know, just try and itemize.
Okay. Okay, is any further discussion? Hi, Jill. Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No abstentions? Okay, so thank you. Let's go ahead and hear from you folks. Let's keep it pretty dense at the start. Okay, so I believe Amy, as usual, passes out a piece of paper. Could you please put your name and town? If you speak, please say who you are and what town you are from. So who, can I see it? Okay. So go ahead, Sean, and then we'll go to Inez and Jody.
Thank you. My name is Sean Murphy, and I'm from Guilford. And it was interesting today to see this article on the front page of the Reformer, and it chronicled the intensive service program here at BAMS and BUHS. And I would just like to make a comment, this is just a general comment, in that I'm a true believer in public education. And I think that programs like this, and like all the great programs here at Brattleboro Union High School, which I am proud to be a board member to, we're able to offer these programs. And I think that it's important to remember that if you have availability of school choice beyond absolute necessity, in that there's no other option, that we need to use public monies for programs within public schools. So I think the reason I mention that is specifically because of the burden issue. You know, they've had public school choice for a long time. But I really think in today's climate, because you're having kids, if a student is handed a check from public monies and then goes to a private school, private high school, I don't think we can really afford that anymore. Things have changed, the climate have changed, and in order to have programs, all these programs, without value judgment, without a value judgment. In other words, these individuals need everything that they get just as much as any student that goes to this school. So I just would like to point that out. That for me, it's a very important thing, and I hope to take that into consideration. Thank you.
So just to be clear, did you say that we could have comments at the end? Because
Yeah.
if you're going to be discussing new material or articles today, I would prefer to reserve my comment to the end when I can respond to it.
Jody Normando from Dummerston, and I wanted to thank both Nikki and Chris to come down here. I've met Nikki at another meeting, but I've never met Chris. But one of the things that has bothered me through this whole process with Chris, the lawyer, that we don't have anything in writing. And it's like kind of what questions you ask are what answers you get, and how you ask the questions are what answers you get. And it would have been really nice along the process to have things that we all could see in writing and not take from like a telephone, you know, play telephone, Ron to Alice to somebody else to the board to the public. And I don't know why we never got anything in writing, but it's nice that you came down here, and thank you.
Thank you.
Only 3 people raised their hands. Anyone else? Are we good? All right, thank you very much. So we're gonna just jump in, if that's okay. I'm gonna introduce Chris and Nikki, and then I'm gonna introduce you guys and have you speak up. Chris Leopold is from Leopold and Walls law firm. They are from up north. We were very lucky to get Chris to help us out. He's a very well-respected lawyer in the state and knows a lot about education in the state and around the country. Nikki is also is now an associate working with Chris, so we are lucky to have her here. As you know, you know us pretty well, I know, but there are 5 towns, and we have voting members and alternate members. The alternate members are vote when the normal voting members are not here, but they are welcome to sit at the table and encouraged to sit at the table. In the small towns, there's one voting and then one non-voting member, and in the larger, in Brattleboro, there's 3 voting and 1 alternate voting. BUHS, who's Dave Scholes is the alternate.
Yep.
BUHS also has 2 members who sit on the committee who are voting members, and they just happen to be residents of Brattleboro. Do you want to quickly go around and then we'll just introduce?
Oh, Mark Truhan, Brattleboro Town School Board.
Ricky Davidson, DOHS School Board.
Jill, Brattleboro Town.
Kim Bryce, Brattleboro Town.
I'm Frank Becker, Business Administrator.
Ron Staley, Superintendent.
Alice Laughlin, Putney.
Richard Glacier, Putney.
Eric Findell, Guilford.
Amy Wall, Dummerston.
Christina Naylor, Dummerston?
Ian Torrey, BOHS.
I'm going to quickly, before I ask you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit more, Jill, just so you know, Beth and Alice are not here tonight. I've invited Eric to sit at the table. He's not a voting or a non-voting member, but I invited him if you have a concern about that.
Just that he should have a name tag.
Okay.
You don't have a marker?
That's something you put on the back.
Yeah, and Walter, you are welcome to sit at the table, but you seem to be very comfortable. Walter is the voting representative from Vernon, but as you know, that has become a complicated situation, and they choose not to sit at the table.
Alice, I have a question.
Yeah.
Nikki, can you clarify what your role was before? Because Alice just called you an associate with Chris, but you were not that role before, right?
That's right. So I'm the former Act 46 Implementation Project Director. That's how I know most of you at this point is through that role, but I am no longer in that role, and I am an associate at Wells and Leopold.
So is there a different person that took your position?
Not as of this time.
So, no direction.
Well, Donna Russo Savage is really the AOE person, that's
Correct.
the point person, let's say.
So guys, before you guys jump in, there are 2 things I'd like us to review with our legal counsel. There's the review, the proposed timeline, if we were to move forward with a merger of this nature. And then the articles, which I know you have lots of questions about, or you want to delve into them. I think I'd like to do the timeline first, because that's important. If that's all right, quickly review it. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a hard copy of it. I neglected to bring one, and I don't know if Barb sent one out. Is that correct?
I don't believe so. I
Okay.
did have the last version, which we
Use that.
reviewed last time.
Yeah, there has been no change to that version, so.
Okay, so everyone should have a
What
copy
you
of that.
had last meeting would be still current, we know, Chris will have some edits for it.
Okay, so Chris and Nikki, do you want to start, or shall we just?
So, I don't know whether Ron wants to review, or Frank wants to review the timeline, and then I can comment on it.
Okay.
But it might be better to have you run through the timeline, and then I can comment and point out a couple of areas of concern or some issues that the committee ought to be aware of.
That works for me.
Before we start, is it possible to use that thing, Ron, right behind you? Doesn't that do, like, put the piece of paper underneath it? And
No, it doesn't, that
No,
is,
it projects from a.
It's no
that's,
mobile
it hooks
thing?
up to the computer.
Just thinking we could all look at it at the same time.
I don't know if you were able to make a connection.
Not sure, but I think it was online as well. Did we put it on the website?
So it should be on the website.
Yeah, so you would have it on
That's
Wyndham website as well. And it is the hard copy that was distributed last meeting.
Okay.
I was just thinking for people in the public that'd be easier to follow if we had something to look it up. I'm happy to put mine hooked on, but I need a cable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with cable.
Well, why don't you guys start and I'll play and look.
Okay.
All right, let me go
Thank you,
over
Jill.
this sheet, which I think the members of the public received last time. I'm hoping the committee members have this.
So, we did confirm with Vernon, that their board did vote to, develop warning articles or, have warning articles, to leave the BUHS Union District, and a tentative date would be August 9th for that. They have a meeting June 27th, to adopt the warning articles. We know we can't post them until a 40-day window, and I think that's like July 6th to be able to do that. Then the study committee would submit our articles to the State Board of Education for a pre-K through 12 unified union district that would exclude Vernon. The assumption, we would do that in July with the assumption that the Vernon vote is positive to withdraw. If that doesn't happen, things change. But at any rate, the state board would review those, our articles, and also consider the Vernon district vote. We would have a meeting with them. I think the previous date was in August, but we've been notified that September 20th would be the appropriate date to meet with the state board on, if we go ahead with the unified union district. That would then call for a public vote of all towns, excluding Vernon, in November 8th. And then if that's a positive vote, at that time, board members are elected in that vote. And then we start the budget process with a tentative timeline of February 2017, with the idea that the Unified Union District becomes operational in July 1st, 2017. So in the detailed timeline, what's added to that after the State Board of Education is just a series of public information sessions that would have to happen in each town. And then a lot of other details that I'm not sure, Frank, I don't know if we really need to review those at this point, unless there's some particular issue that has been brought up.
Right, so you mentioned the September 20 board meeting, and then we know that there does need to be an agreement between Vernon and BUHS, and there's a process that maybe Chris might want to speak to, that essentially does have to sit in between this process, and I'm not sure, I guess that has to happen before September 20th, is that correct, Chris, the
Yes.
agreement? Yeah, so actually we would insert in this schedule an important event there, where between, if there was a successful vote in Vernon to leave the union, and then subsequent to that, and before September 20th, there needs to be an agreement between Vernon School District and BUHS Board to agree on the terms of that exit. And in a simplest version of that, which we would think likely would be simply the interest in the assets, Vernon's interest in the assets of the Union High School would be offset by Vernon's obligation to pay the existing debt on the high school bond, which is about 14 million. So
What do you
one
mean
other.
by that? I understand the words, but I don't understand how that would play out.
Well, right now, all 5 member towns have a proportional share of through the school funding process annually to pay the debt. And if Vernon is no longer a member, they won't be part of that funding formula. What's likely is many of those Vernon students that attend BUHS will continue to attend, but they will be attending through a tuition arrangement. And it's again likely that the remaining member towns would not see a substantial difference in the cost of education because that tuition payment would cover the equivalent share of their debt payment. But these are all just assumptions, you know, this is what would need to be analyzed and agreed to.
So I'm still lost. Maybe everybody else is completely clear on this, but you guys can stop me if I'm a little lost. So right now, Vernon pays to BUHS for each student that comes in?
No, Vernon is just like Brattleboro Town and Dummerston in that 2010 Act 130 stopped payments between local district for elementary operating boards to the Union High School. That went away. So no checks are gone from the school district to the high school. Essentially, the funding formula just says the UHS in any region, in our region, Brattleboro Union, is a separate district. So you'll just add up debt, all operating costs, divide by the number of kids, calculate a tax rate. That goes to each town office. That tax rate is weighted with the local district tax rate. That's how, when you open up the box, the mailbox, any resident, they're taking the weighted share of their elementary tax rate and their high school tax rate, and the debt is paid. What we're talking about is if the UHS closed business permanently today, there are assets and there are liabilities to be settled up. So we have to freeze that moment in time for Vernon. We have to evaluate their interest in the assets versus their obligation to pay the liabilities. And we have to say, is there essentially an equal asset and liability interest, which therefore nets to zero, and there's essentially no remuneration on either side to be dealt with? Or is there some other arrangement that someone perceives that somebody owes somebody?
And so we're in consultation with Paul Giuliani, who does this sort of work. And quite frankly, it's probably kind of a clean slate where their debt equals the asset. And so it would be kind of a wash in a sense.
So from very practical terms and not worrying about accounting, does it make a difference to the rest of us if Vernon is not there?
And the answer is, as long as the tuition payment that Vernon makes to the UHS essentially carries the equivalent cost of what everybody's paying now, which is likely, then there is no net impact. But you know, that there you start the discussion about well, how many Vernon kids are going to go to Pioneer versus Brattleboro Union High School versus, and so you know, you have to make some assumptions. But under the assumption that essentially the patterns that have existed for 40 years, where the majority of Vernon kids go to the UHS, if that continues, then you know, on a preliminary level, we don't see a substantial impact to the remaining districts.
Yeah, and historically, we've been anywhere from 50 to 80%. Most recently, it's probably been 80%. So we would look at that and say, if 50% of the students are tuition to the UHS and Vernon, we're still in good shape. It doesn't have a negative impact to the rest of the district.
So, go ahead.
But in the end, what you're saying means that Vernon, if that were to happen, Vernon would be released from the debt, but they're also released from any value assets that we
Right.
have.
No check from the
Right.
high school.
And because the average numbers of Vernon students would almost make up for the fact that Vernon is no longer paying that. From a other town perspective, we won't see our share of paying for the debt increase. However, if that were to decline rapidly for some other reason, we would see some increase because we both have the asset and the debt.
Yeah.
Unless it was built into
Some other arrangement.
Another agreement.
Right.
But just to finish that thought, that was very well articulated in that. Just remember, it's BUHS spending minus revenue, right? Is net spending divided by kids. So what we're going to see is we have $1 million in tuition revenue now from Marlboro, you know, Stratton, other towns. That will likely go to somewhere toward $2 million. So our cost is the same, our revenue increases, and it reduces the net spending. Now we lose the Vernon kids in our town. So not only do our revenues increase, but our head count reduces. And that's what Richard just articulated without the equation.
Yeah.
Essentially nets itself out.
And so then the next logical question here is Dummerston had also voiced something at the last meeting about possibly not wanting, I mean, how many towns could look at doing this before we destroy ourselves at the Union High School level?
Well, you know, we had, earlier in the study committee report, had a modified union district that allowed for 2 districts to leave and still have a viable option unless it was Brattleboro town. Because I think the number, well, I know the numbers in Brattleboro town are significant that would impact going forward with the unified district.
So guys, it's 5:30 and there's a lot to talk about tonight. We're gonna end right before 7. So what I would suggest, are there any questions? I know this is a big one, I understand. I guess I will ask Chris to jump in. Are there any other answers to questions that we might be thinking of?
So I guess a couple of things, I think a couple of things that it's important for the study committee to understand. There is no school district in Vermont that has voted and left a union school district since the current statutory scheme went into place.
And when is that, like 2 years?
No, I mean, this is well long before anybody ever mentioned the word Act 46. So it goes back to the late 1960s, early 1970s. So Vermont, prior to the current statute about withdrawing from a union school district, used to provide, you can withdraw from a union school district, but you have to withdraw before it incurs any debt. If it incurs any debt, then you're stuck in it forever. It's not possible to ever leave it. The legislature around 1970 changed the statute and said, let's think about this a little differently. If a district wants to leave and the other people are amenable to their leaving and they can reach an agreement, that's okay with us. We'll let that happen. Since the new statute went into place, no district has ever voted to withdraw, and there's been no withdrawal throughout the state. I'm aware of one case under the old statute where a district withdrew before the district ever incurred any debt and before it was more than a year old. Somebody had second thoughts and decided to withdraw. So there's very little history here. So that I want to make you aware about the lack of history, particularly in the context of, so what's this agreement supposed to be? The law provides that if a district votes, the district then reaches an agreement on its withdrawal. The agreement, while it may be negotiated by Brattleboro, isn't approved by the Union High School voters or by the board. It's approved by the other member districts. So each member district has to vote to let somebody withdraw. The next step in the process is that under the statute, the State Board of Education has to, at that point, approve the withdrawal. And this sort of goes to your question in part, which is the state board at that point is looking at it and saying, so gee, if this school district withdraws, they have 2 questions. One, does this school district have a place to send their students? And I'd tell you, probably 20 years ago, in some areas of the state, that was a concern to the state board if that had happened, because relative to enrollments and lack of capacity in some areas in the school systems. The second issue is if we let this district withdraw, is the Union School District still a viable district? Is the debt, are the expenses, the cost of operating this school district too expensive for the remaining districts to be able to manage? State boards never had to deal with that issue. But in terms of, so if 3 of your districts voted to withdraw, the state board might have a very different perspective on how they looked at that issue. The law provides that the districts reach the agreement and they approve the agreement before it goes to the state board. This timeline is trying to have the state board approve the withdrawal contingent on everybody voting to approve all this. And so there's a slight factor that the state board's gotta say, yes, we'll do that, rather than requiring the vote to occur before they consider it. It makes sense in the context of you're trying to form a unified union with the other districts. If you weren't trying to do that, I think that I wouldn't be telling you it's even a possibility. I'd say the other districts have to reach the agreement first, and then the state board will approve it second. Ultimately, you've got to get the state agency to say, yes, we think this approach makes sense in terms of a timeline and a process, and we agree with it. It's a rational approach. Hopefully they'll agree that it's rational and that those two things can happen contemporaneously. Otherwise, what you need to do is your timeline's going to be backed up by requiring that the districts first have to vote to approve this, then it goes to the state board for their approval and approval of your study committee report at the same time. It's a chicken and an egg situation, because if you're looking at it, you might not want to approve this if you're not trying to form a UU. Okay.
Can I ask for clarification? You said a little while ago that Brattleboro wouldn't approve it, the other member districts. You mean Brattleboro Elementary School?
No, I mean Brattleboro Union. It's not up to the Union High School Board itself. It's up to the member districts, which are all of the towns that are part of BUHS, whether it's at the middle level and the high school level, whatever their participation is.
And as we've set it up in this timeline, it would be a vote at the same time of
Yes.
everybody, and it would be a majority, so it wouldn't fail on, say, Putney saying no. Or
No,
it would
no,
be
so there's three,
overall.
so let's say that this timeline works, that everybody in Montpelier in terms of the state board says, this timeline makes sense, we agree with the process, let's go with it. And they approve your study committee report. What would happen in November is, by Australian ballot, each of the towns would individually vote, with the exception of Vernon, would vote on 3 articles. Article 1, shall we agree to let Vernon withdraw from the Brattleboro Union High School District upon the terms and conditions as negotiated? A copy of the report is on file in the town clerk's office. That'd be Article 1. Article 2 is, shall we approve the articles of agreement as recommended by the study committee? And it would, in a very cursory manner, consistent with the statute, identify the key elements of that in the statutory framework. The third article would be to elect school directors for the new unified district. Each town that votes has to approve Article 2 by a town vote. If any town voted no, the proposition would fail, because you're identifying right now all the districts as necessary. So it's not a combined vote, so how have all of us voted together? It literally is, does Putney want to do this, yes or no? Does Guilford want to do it, yes or no? Any town fundamentally has the ability to say, nope, we're not going to do this, and at that point the proposition as it's presently structured fails.
What about the first article?
The first article, you'd have to make a decision, both, I think, in terms of a study committee as well as what the way it's structured in the context of, so do you let Vernon out even if Article 2 fails?
No, I mean, does, for the Article 1, does each town have a veto to Article 1?
Correct,
Or it's not a-
excuse me.
it's not a colla-
It's not a collective.
Okay.
Any town individually has the ability to do that. And go back to the way it was in 1960, the reason the legislature structured that way is if Putney isn't happy with the terms and conditions of letting Vernon out, the legislature said Vernon should be stuck. They're in there. This is better than the prior law where they couldn't ever leave. So that's the way that the policy behind it, right or wrong, that's what the legislature determined.
So, I'm sorry, so any town can stop the withdrawal of Vernon with a no vote on Article 1?
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And all three votes are gonna have to pass. And you couldn't come back with a split.
So the third vote, just to be real clear, that's just electing people, so that doesn't have to pass, but the first two would have to be passed, unless people said, you know what, we don't care whether we form a unified union, we're willing to let Vernon out regardless.
And then we would do that even without forming another one?
You could do that without forming a unified union, you could say that, or you could say alternately, in the terms of what you negotiate with Vernon, say, we don't want you to leave unless we're forming a unified union. If we don't form a unified union, then all bets are off.
And then after the vote, the Department of Education could come back and say, we're not gonna let Vernon out unless there is a supervised, unless you do form a district. In other words, if we voted down 2 but kept 1,
Yeah.
the state could come back and say that we're not gonna allow that.
So the way it's structured here is that you'd be getting the state board to approve that in advance before the actual election.
And they would tell us whether they would allow it to happen.
They tell you whether or not, I mean, we're gonna know in a couple of weeks whether or not they're gonna let you do that once this starts to proceed.
And if we changed one of the towns to advisable, that would, in the current scenario, that would allow, if that particular town voted no on Article 2, it would allow the other 3 towns to proceed, correct?
It allows the other towns to proceed only if you have said that in the absence of everybody voting yes, we're going to form a modified unified union school district.
No.
And if you've warned everybody of that, and it's in the study committee report, and it's on the articles, then you could have an advisable district vote no and form a modified union if a majority of the town school districts vote yes. But you have to clearly warn that, you have to let the voters know, hey, this is gonna happen. If 4 out of 5 vote yes, this is what we're going to do.
And then also would the advisable town, but you'd still need to have everybody on Article 1 be voting yes for Vernon to withdraw for that to happen.
Correct.
In that
Correct.
case. Okay.
And Vernon has to vote too, yes? Vernon has to vote to withdraw, to allow.
Well, Vernon would have voted in August
Oh,
under this
sorry,
timeline,
thank you.
and I think under what their board is planning, they would be voting in August. It's sort of the, under the scenario that you're looking at and that we were asked to think about and talk about tonight, it all presupposes that Vernon votes in August and that Vernon votes yes in August. If Vernon votes no in August, then you have to relook at several of your articles and say, so what do we want to do in terms of decisions?
So what happens in this scenario if, I'm not predicting this, but just a possibility, what if the towns vote not to allow Vernon to leave, but to merge, when Vernon isn't even voting on merger? How does,
That's a good question.
what
You
happens
make
then?
the articles are contingent upon each other, and the study committee report would have to say that it's contingent. The formation of the new district is contingent upon the approval of Vernon leaving the SU. That's one. The second thing is, as long as Vernon's a member of BUHS, legally, you can't do anything in Wyndham Southeast unless Vernon votes on it. So, and I'm saying Vernon because Vernon's talking about leaving. You couldn't do anything if Putney wasn't voting on it. Because you're all in Brattleboro Union together and you can't break up Brattleboro Union unless you all agree at the ballot box to form something new, or you agree to let people leave, and that's all part of the package.
Chris?
Yeah.
So the other completely different option is still available, right, that we could, from what I understand from Rebecca Holcomb's letter, we could also just say, we're gonna all merge and put Vernon down as advisable.
So, in the context of forming a pre-K through 12 district, either for some or all of you, there's only two ways to do it. One is the way that I just outlined. And this is, when I say that, there's a third way. Let's talk about the third way first. It's the simplest. Everybody at the table, including Vernon, says, yes, we want to do this, yes, we want to vote on this, and let's vote on it. And you vote on forming a unified union. In the absence of that, you can form a unified union by saying, well, Vernon's not sure what they want to do, and we're not sure what some other people may ultimately do, and we're going to label districts as either all necessary, or we're going to label some we're going to label some districts as all advisable, or we're going to label some districts as necessary or some districts as advisable, depending on what they're telling us. And if, when we vote, a majority of the town school districts vote yes, but at least one votes no, we've formed a modified union school district. There's one of those in the state. It's in Chittenden East. It's the Mount Mansfield Modified Union School District.
And there's another one forming in Lamoille North.
So they've been operating since January 1 of 2015. They're the only current operating one in the state. That's the second option. The third option is the option that we've been talking about for the past 20 minutes, and you talked about at your last meeting, which is to say, look, we understand that there's a district that really says, not only do we not want to form a unified union, but we really think that we'd like to leave the existing, the unified union, we'd like to leave the existing union, and that's the process that I've just outlined in terms of how that could happen. Those are the three options if you want to form essentially a pre-K through 12 modified union or a unified union.
Chris, I hate to ask this because I want to move on, but can you address, if it was a modified union, we would have to have a supervisory union with the two districts? Or can you talk about that a little bit?
Under current state law and the way it's been applied by the State Board of Education and the Agency of Education, if you formed a modified union, you would have to have a supervisory union. You'd have two districts that were assigned to the supervisory union. One, I'll call it the semi-independent district, and the other the modified union. And you could streamline the governance of the supervisory union. That would have to be approved by the State Board of Education, and that was done for Mount Mansfield and Chittenden East, and it's being done for Lamoille and Lamoille North. And when I talk about streamlining, the streamlining is so that the governance of the SU in some way reflects that, I'll take Chittenden East for example, you have one district that has about 150 students in it, and you have another district that has several thousand students and represents 90% of the population, and it represents 90% of the staffing in the SU. And so when they looked at it, and the state board looked at it, they said, okay, we'll develop a different governance structure, and the governance structure of the SU essentially is the modified union board for which the semi-independent district's on, and then the semi-independent district has an additional representation when the SU board formally meets as an SU board. So if you applied it here, let's say right now you're looking at a 9-member board, you might be looking at a modified union board that had 9 members. Your SU board would essentially be a 9-member board. It would include a representative from Vernon, because there's a representative from Vernon on your board, presently the Union School Board. And then secondly, it would include a additional representative from Vernon as a representative of the Vernon Town School District Board. And that's how they've structured it.
But we could write into the articles of
You could write something different. I mean, I'd tell you that because there's no track record here, it's sort of open to people being creative in terms of, so how do we structure how we're gonna function as a supervisory union? It's open. Ultimately, it has to be approved by the state board. You could do that today. I mean, state law permits you today to say, hey, let's submit a different governance structure to the state board for approval for Wyndham Southeast, and the state board can look at it and say, that makes sense, and do it. And they've done that for a couple of SUs in the state.
Okay. So can we go ahead and, did you have a question?
Can articles of agreement request that in lieu of forming a supervisory union, that any dissenting districts be reassigned to another supervisory union? To keep things simple for the folks that want to move forward?
Exactly, that's.
It's legally possible. I would tell you that to date, the state board hasn't done that. It doesn't mean they won't do it. I think what they wanna, the difficulty is, and I'll talk specifics because we're talking specifics. If you did that and you formed a MUD, and Vernon is semi-independent because they've maintained their status as an independent elementary school district, the difficulty is that they're still part of this union. And it's unlikely that the state board, at least based on past experience, is going to say, well, we're going to assign the town school district somewhere else, even though their students come here and attend high school here as resident students. That's the difficulty of it.
But we have that now with Marlboro students. They're in a separate supervisory union.
So that's a tuition.
It's tuition.
But they're not part of the union.
If everybody voted for Vernon to leave
Yes.
That's different
the
than the mod.
UHS district, then what you just said wouldn't hold true. They would just tuition in their kids that wanted to come here.
That's correct, and you wouldn't have a modified union, they wouldn't be part of a modified union, they'd be a totally independent school district.
I think we're floating around the idea of another town, So I think we probably want to talk to you more about this at some point. We may, but if it's all right with you guys, since it's getting late, can we jump into the report?
So I have a few extra copies, and I guess one thing that I'll say when you see the cover page, did everybody get one? I've got a
But
few extra.
before we go, I'm confused. What we're talking about here is incredibly complex, and we're rushing through it, and I know, Alex, you've spent more time on it with Chris and all of that, but for the rest of us, unless I'm the only one who's slow in the room, this is a lot to take in and to go on. So we only have Chris here tonight, right?
Well, what I'm leaning towards doing is, we could talk about this one topic for 2 hours. And what I would suggest is that we ask Chris to do a phone, chat with us via phone about this issue, after we've collected all the questions that we might have. We could keep talking now, but we have about an hour left of our meeting.
So one thing that is also happening is Chris and Frank and I, have kind of constant communication as we develop this flow chart and then the more detailed thing. So what we'll do is continue having that discussion and revise this and bring it back to this group.
So what do we hope to gain on this? Just
I'm not gonna take a question.
We're trying to understand what we've written that's wrong, or what Chris wants to.
No, what I think what we need to do is, this is the latest version that, without Vernon. So I want to make sure that we all understand that, and then there are some other points that I think Chris would advise us on. The study report.
All right, my head's just swimming, I guess. I feel like we're going off onto this.
Well, it's all tied in. You'll see it in the
Yeah,
first
I'm
and
sure.
second.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, as chair, I
Article.
completely acknowledge that there's a lot to be discussed and flushed out here. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's like whenever we review any options, it's always sort of hazy at first, and then we go back and forth, and you guys talk with Chris, and clarity sort of comes.
And if we have time at the very end, we can come back.
Yes.
So I want to point out on the cover page that there's an error there. Vernon should not be crossed out. Brattleboro is the current voting member. So for purposes of the state AOE, they indicated that they're still members. They can choose to participate as they want. And I think Mike Hebert was voted as the alternate, so
Yes.
we'll correct that as well. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to take us through some of the pages that really don't have any changes, just to kind of say, when we look at the executive summary, page 2 and 3, those are all, that hasn't changed. When we look at page 4, cost implications, the changes there will be the bold print, see Appendix A from the PICA study. So we have not attached that. That's a document that Frank has developed and you've seen as a study committee. But for this report, we would attach an appendix with those staffing numbers. Because that really supports the concept, and this is what the AOE wanted, that give us some more detail as to why you think you'd save $1 million over a 3 to 5 year period. And if you remember Frank's student-teacher ratio, it was like 500,000 within, I don't know, was it a year or two?
2 years.
Yeah, so we'll attach that as needed. The next paragraph there, that homestead education tax rate, that needs to be changed because that was based on the 10-cent incentive. So that will need to be adjusted to the 8,642. So not only will that first number, the 991,000, but also the 2.9 million. So that'll be changed, updated. So then we get into, well, the last bold thing on that page, financial models. Those are appendixes that we've already had in there. So the tax impact by district, so we'll update those as well. So then we get into the articles, and some still have crossouts, like Article 1, this needs Chris revision. Chris has revised it, so next time I revise this document, that'll be gone, because that's already been changed. So do you want to speak to that?
So yeah, I'll start to go through these. So Article 1 has been revised. The revision deletes any reference to Vernon, and it names the remaining town school districts as necessary school districts. That has two implications. One, they're required to vote on the articles, and secondly, they have to approve individually the articles. So a cumulative vote doesn't matter, it's the individual vote of each town school district. The top of page 5 just reinforces that. Article 2 has been revised so that it deletes the reference to Vernon and it deletes the reference to Vernon's students and the grandfathering that existed under the prior drafts. Article 4 has been revised to clarify the date on which the new unified board will begin to operate the existing school facilities. Article 6 has been revised to, one, put in a date regarding the assumption of capital debt and interests of the various parties that are part of the articles. Subsection B also talks about the assumption of any surplus or deficits relating to the Wyndham Southeast Supervisor Union. And then paragraph C hasn't been changed, but let me just comment on that. That provides that if any of the individual town school districts or Brattleboro Union have any restricted funds, so Putney has a capital reserve fund for building maintenance and repairs, and there's $100,000 in it, the new district can only use those $100,000 for capital repairs and improvements at the Putney School. Brattleboro Union has a $15,000 scholarship fund from Jane Doe, who died and endowed a scholarship fund. The new district can only use those funds for purposes consistent with Jane Doe's gift and the establishment of the endowment. Article 7D has been changed just to rephrase the language in the prior version to clarify, so that prior to the vote by the board to close a school, there has to be a year of study and public input. That concept was in the earlier draft. We really just revised the phraseology for clarification.
And that still maintains that there'd be no closings within the first 5 years.
Correct, that's unchanged. Article 8 has been changed in 2 areas of import. The first is that Vernon has been removed from the listing of towns and the number of school directors that must reside in that town. The director that was going allocated to be a resident of Vernon is now designated as an at-large school director. So it goes from 2 at-large school directors to 3 at-large school directors.
And the purpose really was to maintain the 9 total numbers.
The second change the next change relative to the Board of School Directors is in Article 9. And state law requires that you evenly apportion the terms of office. So that you have, if you have 9 directors, you have 3 with, in this case, with a 2-year term, 3 with a 3-year term, and 3 with a 4-year term, rather than having 3, 2, and 4, as it originally existed in this draft.
Originally, it was 1, 2, and 3.
And that's the second change, and I want to speak to that. So originally, you were voting on this late this spring, a couple of weeks ago. And when you were intending to do that, people that were elected for a 1-year term would have been elected for 1 year. They would have taken office at the earliest in August, and they would have served until the date of your annual meeting in 2017. Under this timeline, these folks are going to be elected in November, the earliest that they're gonna take office is in January. And then the current articles call for them to stand for election at your annual meeting in 2017, which might be 2 months away. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and so the law actually provides for 2, 3, and 4-year terms. And so we changed it so that it's 2, 3, and 4-year terms, so that in fact, when your directors are elected, the people that are elected for a 2-year term are really going to end up, their term commences in January, and then they would stand for re-election, or their term would end in the spring of 2018.
So I know there are gonna be questions about that. Do we wanna talk about that now, or can we keep moving through Chris's explanation of the document?
I just have a quick question, because this is just for the first round, and then once those terms are done, everyone goes to a 3-year term.
Correct.
Okay. And
These are just the initial terms
Yeah.
for the people that are elected in November.
That's a
Thereafter,
really
it's a
good-
3-year
A
term.
3-year or a 4-year term?
a 3-year term.
3-year
Yeah,
term.
yeah.
Which is not really written in here.
Right.
It doesn't, it's
not-
specified in
it does
state
not specify.
statute, there's no choice.
Right.
You couldn't write anything different in here relative to the terms after the initial.
So that's a really good point, because there was concern that, well, I'm not sure if I wanna run for a 4-year term. But in practice, it's really gonna be 3 years, and the
Right.
3-year will be 2, and the 2-year will be 1 the first round. But then it goes to 3 years, like, this is great.
Let's keep going.
Yep.
Yes.
The paragraph below the listing of the spread of the terms just incorporates the concept that I just identified. Article 10 at the top of page 9 changes the date of the vote, so it's being submitted in November. It needs to specify November 8th unless you're thinking of a different date. Article 11 has just been modified to delete Vernon from the listing of districts. In Article 13, a date was inserted so that the board is required to establish those policies regarding the support and encouraging public participation, so that those policies are developed and approved by the board before June 30th of 2017, i.e. before they become fully operational and they're educating students, they need to do that. Article 14 is language to require that the vote to approve the school budget is by Australian ballot.
The top line there, this doesn't show what we had before, right? So I thought we'd talked about the annual budgets being presented at town meeting, or we'd talked about even having to have town, or some budget meeting information in January, so that there could be discussion at town meetings and such. This just says pursuant or in accordance with something, I don't know what that really says in the statute. So, didn't we have something else more specific?
So we didn't revise that earlier draft, I don't know whether whether that was done by your office, and I don't remember the language off the top of my head. for
I think Article 14 was just the Australian ballot. I think you're referring to the school leadership
Oh,
council.
might be in there.
There's nothing in there.
Okay. I just remember we talked about budgets.
Yeah.
The vast majority of school merger study committee reports the last year and a half, if not all of them, have had a requirement that the budget has to be approved by Australian ballot. And part of that is because in many of those communities, that's how all the budgets are approved already, so they continued it, but that's been the prevalent trend throughout the state. Article 15, the leadership councils. Article 15, as it's been revised from your earlier drafts, provides that the board will develop and encourage policies regarding local input, and the board will consider the establishment of local school leadership councils, and that's outlined in Appendix B.
This is not what we had talked about wanting when this came up the last time.
Right, so this is one of the articles that's gonna take a fair amount of our time talking about. Should we go ahead and do that now, or do we wanna go through the rest of the articles and come back to this?
I
Let's
would
finish the articles.
finish the articles.
We're almost
They're
done.
kind of basic, and they speak to
Yeah,
policy,
we're
which
almost done.
is consistent with 15.
Great.
So 16, 17, and 18 do not include any current revisions to those other than identifying Article 18 as Article 18.
Actually, I think we redid the numbering after Article 14, which was a total addition to the draft, the last draft that we edited.
Yep. So you're on to Appendix B, Ron.
Okay.
So Chris, do you wanna explain your thinking here?
I'd be happy to. So relative to the school leadership councils, I've expressed several concerns that I have just recommended to Ron and to Alice that the study committee consider. And they fall into a couple of areas. The first is that relative to moving outside of the general statutory framework of the items that need to be considered into a study committee report. My experience working with study committees, and my experience is also based on being a school board member for 7 years and working as a school attorney for 25 years, is to try to strike a balance in the articles of agreement relative to what's necessary and appropriate, and at the same time not placing the study committee in the process, in the role of being a group of people that are making decisions that perhaps ought to be made by the first board of school directors relative to school policies and procedures, and encumbering that board and its successors in the context of your charter. And so one, I generally think that this is an area that falls into that, and I think it's an area that it's appropriate for a study committee to recommend, and you may conclude it's appropriate to include in your articles. But I think that if you do so, you should do so cautiously, and there's some areas that I think that you should carefully consider. So one, I believe generally that this is an area that ought to be recommended to a board rather than become part of the charter. The second is that school advisory councils were originally part of a national movement in large urban school districts that generally had more than 40,000 students. And it was intended in school districts that had large student populations with a large number of schools to try to give an opportunity for voice to an invisible board. And usually an invisible administration as well. And within that framework, one, in the states that required these to be enacted by state statute, they mandated the formation of these. One, in the states that have done that, for example, in Massachusetts or Florida, they prohibit school board members from being on the advisory council because they believe that there is ought to be a separation in terms of the advisory council truly advising the board and having a board member on it. And so one recommendation I would make to you is to seriously consider, if you're going to continue with this, whether or not school board members ought to be on it, because I think that there ought to be a division of those roles, and I think at times it may be a conflict of interest for a board member to be on the advisory committee and trying to serve in that role, and yet at the same time with the advisory committee comes to the board and makes a recommendation to the board to fulfill their responsibility as a board member and to make an independent judgment based on that matter. I think the other thing is that relative to the role of school directors, one of the things I would also point out is that under the current structure that you're looking at, you're talking about your school directors being elected at large, whether they're from an individual town or whether they're being elected by the entire district. And as such, those individuals and the basis, the legal basis for that framework being a valid framework is those board members represent the entire district. They may be from the town of Dummerston or Putney or Brattleboro or Guilford, but they represent the entire district. And so there's a question that I think, again, is if they're on the advisory council, is there any conflict between their representing the entire district and they're serving on an advisory council? The last thing about the issue of the boards is that I think if a board member is on an advisory council and the advisory council is established by the board, and a part of the organizational structure, and I think if it's part of the Articles of Agreement, there's no doubt about that, then I believe that those advisory council meetings become public meetings under the open meeting law. And I think the operation of them and their ability to provide advice and to work, it changes the nature of their work, and I think it changes the nature of their role and some of the give and take that you might like to have. So I think be aware that I think if board members are on it, I think they will need to be warned and regarded as subcommittees of the board, and they will need to follow all the requirements of the open meeting law relative to that.
Well, relative to that, could a new union district member be on a leadership council if they were like an ex officio, like as an advisory type of thing, or is that combining?
So, I mean, there's no difference between an ex officio and a regular member. Ex officio only means you're on the committee as a result of the office that you hold.
Okay.
So if you say on a leadership council, we'll have the chair and the vice chair of the board, they have all the rights and privileges of any other member,
Right.
but they're there by virtue of their office. That's what ex officio means in that context. The other change that I recommended is that you had the community members being elected at town meeting. And the concern that I have with that is that I think if you are electing people at town meeting, you're effectively creating an office. And I don't believe that school districts have the ability to create offices. I think school boards have the ability to appoint people to things, but I don't think under state statute you have the ability to create an office. And I think the election of someone becomes the creation of an office. we changed that to a nomination process so that people in a town meeting format could be nominated, or they could be considered in that context. But I think that the idea of election is something that is inconsistent with state statute and the powers of a school board to be able to create an office in that context. The last change that I think we made of significance that I want to comment on is the relative to hiring committees. Current state law vests total and complete authority regarding the appointment of school staff with the superintendent. Under state law, the board doesn't have a role. It's the superintendent. And relative to licensed staff, your teachers, or other administrators, what state law says is it's the role of the superintendent to come forward to recruit and to nominate a candidate or recommend a candidate to your school board for appointment. It doesn't mean that the superintendent has to do all of that by himself or herself, but it means that they make the decision whether or not they're going to have a hiring committee or not have a hiring committee, and how the hiring committee is going to recommend or not recommend or give him or her 2 or 3 names. And so the change that we made is consistent with state statute relative to the statutory role of the superintendent in the appointment process of school staff. It doesn't mean that the superintendent can't say, I'm gonna have a hiring committee, and this is how the hiring committee is gonna be done, and throughout most of the state, that's done. The point I'm trying to make is, in the Articles of Agreement, it's not appropriate for you in the Articles of Agreement to in any way restrict the superintendent's rights and responsibilities under state law, because the statutes are very clear about that.
And that question came up recently at a board meeting, and I pointed out that, let's say like a principal search, we would use the same practices that we do right now with the screening committee and focus groups and all of that. So I would see, consistent with the state statute being covered there, and also procedures established by the superintendent as we do now. So these advisory councils would have a very strong role in that process as it is now.
So I know we're gonna be talking about this more at our next meeting. But what questions do you folks have? Yeah, go ahead.
So Chris, I mean, I hear you're saying that this is not something you necessarily recommend, but part of the reason why we put this in was because we were hearing from our communities that they wanted some local control. So what's a recommendation to let the local community, other than electing their one board member and their couple of at-large board members, what's another way in which you would recommend that we could give some local control to local communities and still meet the statutory obligations?
I think from discussions that I've had with Chris, the bulleted items that are in here do that.
But unfortunately, the very nature of the leadership council, which is to me different than a advisory council. We chose leadership over advisory for a reason. The bullets themselves, as you described, do that, but the whole leadership council is a recommendation, not an establishment by the agreement.
So I guess I think about the fact that board members elected, and hopefully some of you are part of that would want to maintain the intent of this as a recommendation to the new board. I don't see all different people coming in serving as a 9-member board that don't have this type of background to say, this is what we want to create as policy.
So if I could, I want to answer part of this. I think one of the things you ought to think about this is in the context of your individual town charters. And under Vermont law, there's a process where, you have the ability to amend your town charters And once something's in when you amend a charter, it's gotta go up to the legislature after a town votes to do it. And the legislature has to approve the amendment and make sure that they think it's appropriate. And then it becomes part of your town charter. And if there's a town charter, there's a provision that becomes obsolete and you wanna take it out, you've gotta go through the whole process of taking it out, going up to the legislature, having them approve it. This is a little more streamlined relative to your articles of agreement, because it doesn't involve the legislature, but it's not much more streamlined in terms of doing this. There are two comments I'd make. One is that you could take Appendix B as we've revised it, and you could include it in the articles of agreement. I wouldn't recommend it, but I think from the concerns that I have, that the current version is much less problematic, including it in your articles of agreement. And I do want to emphasize that. It's much less problematic to do that. At the same time, I also want to be really clear that this article, the Board of School Directors has the ability to change in the future under the process to revise articles of agreement. This article would fall into that category. There's two things that if you were going to include this in the articles themselves, not as an appendix, that I would include, that I'd suggest you revise further. One is the provision that talks about review faculty 1% professional development requests as related to district-wide action plan. That is so specific that I don't know whether anybody in this room knows that it's going to even exist in 5 years. It may, but it may not. These type of funds, how you deal with action plans, professional development, I've seen it change at least 7 times over the last 25 years that I've been an education lawyer. So I would delete that. It's certainly something the board can add as a charge to an advisory council or a leadership council. I think the second thing that I would do, if I put this in the articles of agreement, is that I'd have a provision that this sunsets or is subject to being reaffirmed by the board in X number of years. If it's a mechanism that doesn't work, the board ought to be able to let it lapse. At the same time, politically, if it's working, your communities aren't going to let the board let it lapse. And I think it's like things that are working with with a school board right now. The board doesn't just willy-nilly change things because the chair or the vice chair decide, hey, I want to change this. There's a process. So I'd think about that if you include it in the articles of agreement. I'd revise the 1%, I'd delete that provision, and then I'd put a provision in that essentially either had this sunset or it was subject to being renewed by the Board of School Directors every 3 or 5 years. So that it's being evaluated about whether or not it's an effective mechanism and it's working for your communities and the board.
And to be clear, Chris, when you say whether are you talking the whole leadership council or just some provision?
I would say both. I'd say both. I mean, I'd say that the concept itself, and then you may have provisions here that don't work at all. But I'd look at that as a framework where there's some flexibility relative to it. I mean, when I was a school board member, these councils were being debated in Vermont in terms of the Vermont NEA seeking to negotiate these into teacher contracts because they were part of the Vermont NEA, the national NEA's agenda, looking at what was happening with large urban school districts. So these ideas have been around for a while, and there are a number of schools that have advisory councils. Most of those advisory councils advise their local administration, and the majority of them don't have a board policy behind them, but some have a board policy, and there's 1 or 2 in the state that I'm aware of that are actually written into contracts. Yes.
So you said that these articles can be changed by the board in the future. So if it's not working, couldn't the board just change them? So why put the sunset? So everything in here is therefore changeable. Why would there be a sunset?
So everything's
That's
not,
what we're
everything's
saying.
not changeable.
Okay.
So there are some things that aren't changeable by the board. This is one that would be.
Okay.
If you qualify that.
If it,
If you,
what you're trying to do is do something that's different. And what I'm suggesting is recognize that it's different in the Articles of Agreement. And if you're going to include it in the articles as opposed to a recommendation in an appendix, then don't put the board in the position of, quote, voting it out. Create the possibility that it can lapse just because it's not working, rather than the board voting it out. That's all I'm suggesting.
so, but you would want language for that.
If the committee liked that idea, I don't want to draft language unless the committee says,
Right.
gee, we'd like to see language. That's a waste of your time
Yeah.
and resources to do that. If the committee says, gee, that concept works for us, we'd revise this provision, so one, it's not a recommendation, it's in the articles, and would include a provision relative to a sunset.
Can you remind us the process, if it stays in as an article and without a sunset, how would it be changed by a subsequent board?
So the Board of School Directors would have the ability to warn at their meeting that they, for an upcoming meeting, let's say at our July 7th meeting, amendment to Article 21. And if I were advising the board, I would tell them that they should put that on an agenda. And if they're talking about repealing it, they should specifically say they're talking about repealing it. If they're talking about revising it, they should include on the agenda that's posted in the communities what the revision is that's being considered. And then the board at that meeting would take a formal vote. And if they approve it, it's amended. If they don't, it's not.
So the bar to amend an article that would include this that doesn't strike me as very high.
So the bar to amend an article
Yeah.
that is within the control of the board
Yeah.
Right.
is fairly low. There are articles here that the board doesn't have any control over. The board doesn't have the ability to say, you now have an Article 2 that talks about your operating grades,
Right.
pre-kindergarten through 12. The board doesn't have the ability to say, you know what? Our pre-K program doesn't work for us anymore. We're no longer going to operate grades pre-K through 12. We're dropping that from Article 2. That's up to the voters. That's not up to the board.
Because I think our confusion, Christina and Richard, my question is, how do we know which one's which? You're only saying this is changeable because we're writing that sunset clause in it? And if we don't write that into any of those?
Chapter 11 in Title 16, the Union School District chapter, fundamentally identifies that the provisions that are within the control of the voters are those items that the voters vote on in November, in your case, if you vote on this in November. And so relative to, for example, the districts that are in, the grades that you're operating, how debt's handled, how you elect school board members, how many members each district's entitled to, that's within the control of the voters.
So as, in the way we originally wrote Article 15, would that be in control of the voters as well? Or would that allow?
No, that's within the control of the board, because it's.
So no matter what we do.
Ballot language.
It's ballot language. If it goes on the ballot,
Yeah.
it's within the control of the voters.
I'm sorry, I'm still a little.
I'm still
So
confused.
for, if we go back to the original version that we had.
Prior to May 5th.
Prior to May 5th for Article 15, that would require a ballot change to make a change to leadership councils?
No.
So there's nothing we could do to make I'll just frame this out, if we wanted to make it go to the voters, there's nothing really we could do.
In my opinion, no, because the state statute that talks about what goes on the ballot is fairly prescriptive.
So then, from a sunset clause perspective, what you suggested in terms of how a board would make a change, it really isn't that much more work than a sunset clause.
To me, it's not a question of whether it's more work.
Okay.
It's a question of the board being able to say, this isn't working, we're just going to let it sunset, rather than the board taking affirmative action and having to end something in the articles. That's it, it's principle, it's not process.
Yeah, I understand.
But to further crystallize this in my little brain over here, apparently I'm just slow tonight because there's a lot of stuff floating here. How do we know, we peons, looking at this, what is non-movable and what is not?
So I just briefly reviewed it.
Yeah, so, okay, but then things, debts, whatever, so like something here that says Article 7D, the closure of K6 to K8 schools, that's under the board's control, because that's not specifically
That has to do with property and debt. That's part of the property article that you have. And I would include that by reference on the ballot.
Yeah.
Let me just.
Yep. Do you have a good sense
So,
of what he's talking about?
let me just tell you, so here are the articles that the provisions that have to be voted on by the voters and are within the control of the voters. The grades that you operate, how the board of school directors is determined. So the school board can't come back 3 years from now and say, you know what, we want to have an 18-member board and all of them are going to be from Brattleboro. Whether that's constitutional or not, that's not within the province of the board, it's within the province of the voters. So the board of school directors, the assumption of debts and ownership of school property. And so the way that the school closure provision is presently in your articles, it's under the article dealing with school property. And that's intentional on my part, so that it is within the control of the voters. The board can't look at this article 2 years from now and say, you know what, we're gonna change it. If the board wants to change it, they can propose a change, and the change has to be approved by the voters of the district.
So just as a punch list, Jill, it's Article 2, Article 7, and Article 8.
And 6, it's not 6?
It does include 6, because 6 has to do with debt and transfer of
278.
funds.
2, 6.
I wondered in the
2, 6,
future if we
7,
could mark those out so that it's clear for all drafts going forward that these are ones that would require voter approval. If it's actually built in, so we could.
Or if it weren't even Article 1, 2, 3, the first four or whatever,
Yeah.
so they're in order, but.
But we wouldn't want that in the language of the report.
You don't want that in the language of the report, because if state statute changes, state statute changes, and it
Oh, I
overrides.
see what you're saying,
Yep.
okay.
So, employee contracts, doesn't fall under.
So
that?
employee contracts isn't on the ballot, but the language that you have under employee contracts, it's required by state statute.
So it doesn't fall under the punch list?
It's not a warned article.
It's not a warned article, but it's required under state statute. You can't change it. It's in your articles, but you have no ability to change it.
For a different reason than the others.
So Jill, for example, state statute requires if you're going to be a unified district, you have to operate at least grades K through 12. You can't be a unified union district and not operate grades K through 12. You could change, if you wanted, like the provision on employee contracts, you could change the provision about whether you're gonna be K through 12, but if you do that, you're not a unified union. Okay?
But we could change the way we determine the community use of schools.
You
We
can
could
change,
school choice.
that's correct.
Well, school choice is a statute.
I think the reason
Not the way
this
we
is
have it.
important is because we've had so many discussions about how important is every word of this. And we've gone back and forth with and different people in the community have asked this too, you know, how hard is it to change this? And we have represented up until today that these are like never to be changed, really.
So substantial parts of these are very difficult to change. You've got to go back to the voters to change them. And the voters have to approve the change. There are provisions that, it has nothing to do with Act 46. It has to go back to, from 1970 forward, from when the majority of union school districts in Vermont were formed from 1970 until 2000. These provisions that I'm talking about, that hasn't changed. It has nothing to do with Act 46. Anything that the legislature's done relative to school mergers the last 10 years.
So Australian ballot is Article 14. To change that, we wouldn't have to go back to the voters.
To change that, you do have to go back to the voters, but it's not because it's in the Articles of Agreement. It's because once you start to use an Australian ballot system under state statute, only the voters can change it.
So I guess my point here, without being too obtuse, is that for a rank and file, normal, non-lawyer person to read this and a voter to say, okay, so this can be changed or this can't be changed, how sacrosanct is it? It is not that clear.
So what you're asking for is,
Amy, and then,
so what you're asking for, Jill, is like a list saying, well, just a little matrix saying Article 1, voters change. Article 2, you know, that kind of
I
thing.
just feel like if a voter goes to vote on something, they ought to know what they
Right.
are voting on.
Yeah, it would be reassuring, I think, to voters to know that certain things cannot be changed easily, and it needs their decisions.
That's why the
versus-
leadership council, we talked about not having as an appendix, that Ian brought up earlier, and putting it in because the community input we heard was so strong about having that local voice being definitely coming up to a larger board. The fear of not having that ability was, at least from what I heard, very important.
Ian?
Well, it does sound like if it's in the Articles of Agreement, it will be not necessarily difficult to change, but the board will have to take a distinct stance to change it, and there's a process. But what I was gonna say is it sounds like the list of things that can be easily changed is the short list. So I think what Jill's asking is just which ones can be easily changed by the board. Right?
So would you, I can take 5 minutes and do that right now, quickly for you, and do that, and I'm happy to send up a document that expands upon that, but just so that you understand it tonight.
Okay.
So,
Can I just throw, we have 20 minutes left of the meeting, guys.
all right, I'll be very quick. Article 1 can't be changed by the voters. Can't be changed by the board. Article 2 can't be changed by the board. Article 3 can't be changed by the board because that process is required by state statute. Article 4 could be changed by the board, but it's a non-important article. We're not building school facilities. Are they gonna change it after you've already started? It doesn't matter, okay? Article 5, plan for the first year of operations. The board would have the ability to change that article, but the first year of operations is up to the board anyway. I don't know how they change it or what they do, but they have the flexibility if they wanted to change it. Article 6, no, they can't change it. Article 7, no, they can't change it. All of Article 7. All of Article 8, the board cannot change it. That's within the control of the voters. Article 9, same thing. Article 10 doesn't matter, because the board doesn't exist at the time this becomes of any import. Article 11 is within the control of the board, but again, tell me what they would change in Article 10. Again, that's transition language about what they're going to do to prepare to operate the district. Article 12, the forming districts cease to exist. Theoretically, that's within the control of the board, and I do mean theoretically. The districts cease under state statute. The only issue is how quickly do they cease. Article 13, that's within the control of the board. I would think most of you as local town school districts and the high school have a process or a policy that you say, here's how we solicit input on our budget. So I think, again, the new board would either have a policy or just follow what's in this provision. Article 14, as I indicated, once you start voting by Australian ballot, and this article puts that in place, it can only be changed by the voters. We've talked about Article 15. Article 16, that could be changed by the board. Again, I don't know what they'd change, but it could be changed by the board. Article 17 is saying to the board that they shall develop a policy that could be changed by the board.
And that's the inter-district school choice, when
Yes.
students move from school to school.
Article 18, it could be changed by the board. I assume, again, the high school and each of the town elementary school districts have a policy on use of school facilities. And I would assume that this new board's gonna have the same thing. So while they could change this article, they're going to have that. But the last thing I'd say about this, I've practiced for 25 years. There are few articles of agreements in the state for union school districts that have been changed by the boards. When they've been changed, it's because they've been legally required to change a provision in the articles of agreement. Any of the ones that I've been involved in. It hasn't been because the board says, hey, we're gonna totally redo X, Y, Z because we feel like it. The last thing I'd say is, based on my experience of working with study committees, sometimes I deal with some study committees where there's some concern among some members about what this new board may do or how it's going to do X, Y, and Z. And one of the things I try to say to them, and I hope sometimes it's reassuring, is, you know, it's, look at yourselves in mirrors. Many of you are school board members. And would you do that as a new board member? Just take an article of agreement and change it just because you don't like it, but you know it was approved by the voters, and you know a study committee gave thought and consideration to it. And I'd tell you that I think my experience has been that that doesn't happen. And that your existing school boards act responsibly and thoughtfully, and I think this board is going to act responsibly and thoughtfully. And fundamentally, it has a charge, and the board members have a charge to represent the community and do the best thing for students, taxpayers in your community, and they're held accountable if they're not. I mean, people are voted out of office when a community feels that somebody hasn't properly represented the community. So that's it.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
So, it's 6:45, he's about to leave, and we wanna stop about 5 of 7 to allow folks to get to the award ceremony. I think we probably do wanna see if Chris can talk to us with a conference call perhaps at the next meeting or the following meeting. I do wanna have some public comment. I am wondering if there is consensus, I don't wanna take a vote because Beth is not here. Of course, if there's a motion to do so, I'll recognize it, but is there a consensus about the leadership councils, whether we want to see a draft with Chris putting them back in the articles, with some language that he's throwing out to us? Or do we wanna ask to have him write that and we can look at that next time, or do we wanna talk about that possibility next time?
For me, given the time, and I think I'd like to see the language of it back in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would even say that with and without the sunset clause, but would it be without the sunset?
What is that, do we wanna see some language? Like that, okay? Yeah? Okay, thank you. I'm gonna open up to the public. Can we meet on July 6th and July 21st? And if we meet on July 6th, would it be appropriate to ask Chris to have a 45-minute conference call with us?
If he's available.
If he's not on a beach somewhere?
It won't be on a beach somewhere.
Do those 2 dates work?
Do we need 2 meetings in July?
Well,
It
we
is
might have a
summer,
lot
and
to
people
do.
are hard to have a lot going on in the summer.
I just think by the end of July, we need to probably approve the report. You ready to do it at the next meeting? I don't know.
So I think by July, if we meet on July 6th, we'll know whether we want to approve it by the end of July, right? Does that make sense?
For me, I'm lacking a lot of data financially, to be able to feel like I know whether it's okay to say, yes, Vernon, maybe Dummerston is thinking, I don't know.
So can we schedule July 6th and 21st?
Yes.
Does that,
And we have financial stuff too.
we'll have to, yeah. What do you
21st,
think?
I have a meeting every third Thursday of the month, and I have had for years, and I've blown off so many of these
Okay,
that they don't know who I am, and I'm supposed to lead the damn meeting.
July 6th and, well, July 5th and July 20th?
Well, the 6th is fine, the 20th,
Yeah,
the
that's fine.
21st was problematic.
20th?
20th is okay with me.
6 o'clock.
What time and where?
6. Can you reserve that as a possibility? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
And did you mention July 6th?
July 6th is possible.
Oh,
Are we gonna stick with this spot
20th.
here, or where,
Sorry, say that again?
this spot?
Yeah, it should be good.
There is a condition.
Yeah, they just didn't put it on, so I gotta get.
I will ask someone to put it on.
So July.
That makes everybody feel
Well, no,
better.
it's the PCS doesn't have that, so it would be.
Yeah. Okay, July 6th here at 6 o'clock? Okay,
Here?
Yeah.
Yes.
yes. Is it all right with everyone if we go ahead to public comments so that we can?
July 20th as well?
20.
Location
And
for that.
20th is about,
Was that here?
We could, let's put here?
Sure.
Okay. All right, thank you, Ron.
Yep.
hi, Ron.
Good night. All right, does that work? Yeah? Okay. Guys, as you heard, we're tight on time, but of course, well, who's interested? Can people raise their hands? All right. So I guess I'm gonna start with Tom and then come around.
Very quick,
Introduce yourself and.
Tom Erebert from Putney. Question, if Vernon does leave, does the bondholder have to agree to release Vernon from their obligation. That's question one. Question two, brief comment about your preference for the leadership councils to not interfere with the functioning of the board and not to hobble the board. Part of the point of the leadership councils is to hobble the board. The notion is that in a well-functioning democracy, there's a balance of power. And part of the point of the leadership council is to provide a counterweight that gives local voice authority not only at the ballot box, but also in the daily functioning of the school. So that's, I speaking for myself, would want to see that built into the articles and not have it be at the board's pleasure. That's my comment.
So I'm actually going to interrupt for a second. Chris, could you take a moment to quickly respond? So I should just clarify that you guys are talking to us.
Yes.
They are our lawyers.
Well said.
So please direct your comments to us, and if it's appropriate, Richard said he was interested in the answer, so if you could address the first question.
So relative to the issue of the bondholders, we're consulting with Paul Giuliani, who's the most well-known, respected bond counsel in Vermont relative to specifically that issue relative to the bonds. Under current law, each of the town school districts is jointly and severably liable for that bond.
And know that this specific issue will be discussed much further. Walter, did you have a question? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, just a comment. One of the things the Vernon Board is doing now is coming up with the risk and benefits of voting to leave the district. I think right now we've got the one benefit, or at least most folks in Vernon see as a benefit, is continuing school choice. The risks are, we really don't know. We're assuming if we vote no and everything else, or we vote yes to leave and other things happen, a contract will be formed, and this came up at our meeting this week, we'll still be able to contract special ed and ESL and business office services, and the rate that we pay now that we're charged from the district will be similar in the future. I mean, we have no idea what the ramifications on the taxpayers of Vernon will be moving forward. I mean, really it is. I know a lot of folks are working on it, but if we're voting on the article language on June 27th and having informational meetings in July, it means the sooner we get that information to present it to certainly the Vernon voters, that would be great. So,
Jody?
My questions, I have about 4 or 5 of them, and my question is, can I email them to Chris to get the answers?
No, you cannot.
I've been emailing Donna Russo-Savage, and she answers me.
Chris is our lawyer. It's not his
Well, do you want me to
job.
list the questions then?
You can, what I would suggest is you could send them to Amy or Christina, your representatives, and they could pursue them as they see fit.
But I didn't want an answer out of any of you. I wanted an answer out of Chris and Nikki.
Well, but he's our lawyer, so you don't get to ask.
Well, I don't think that's quite fair, but I'll ask the questions anyway. I wanted to know what the SUs were that were allowed to stay the same, or an alternative. I wanted to know if you had talked about, when we vote in November, is MUD just a fallback? Because I think our people in our communities need to know that MUD is the fallback, or are we voting? Because if somebody votes no, they may want to not merge at all and may not want a MUD. I wanted to know, one of the things that bothered me is that everybody keeps talking about incentives and taxes when both Donna Russo-Savage and the Secretary of Education have said that they're not. They're really monies to cover merging. And then we've heard it from a representative who was on the Education Committee up in the state that we needed to have an exit plan in our articles, and it needed to be more liberal than the SU or the high school exit plan. Those are my questions, and maybe Christina and Amy could ask you.
Thank you. Inez?
Okay, very quickly. I have 4 points. My first is just a drafting comment on Article 9. the language is really confusing about what that term of office is really going to be. And wouldn't it be easier to just define each term of office as beginning on the date of the organizational meeting and expiring on the date of the second annual meeting, whatever that is, for the next set, beginning on the date of the organizational meeting, terminating on the third annual meeting, and so forth, beginning on the date of the organizational meeting and terminating on the fourth annual meeting. Then nobody has to do math and subtract months. That might be one way to do that. I have a tiny concern about the longest term being longer than 3 years, just because the statutory cap for all terms, not just in 706, but in other new districts formed, is always 3 years. So, but it sounds like it's just going to be a month or two off, so that's really not a battle that I want to fight. Then,
I'll stop and I'll answer your
Sure.
question very quickly, which is that state law specifically authorizes 2, 3, and 4-year terms for the initial terms of office for union school directors.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah,
I
it
think he
does.
had talked about that earlier.
Yeah, it does specifically authorize the 2, 3, and 4. And I understand your point about the terminology.
Okay. It's just easier for
It clearly made some sense. Whether it was totally best articulated, it made a lot of sense when you were talking about the original timeline for your vote.
Okay.
And we'll look at that.
Gotcha. Okay. It makes a lot
Okay,
of sense.
one more thing.
I have 3, actually.
Oh, I thought
Okay,
you went through them all.
I'll be very quick. The next point is, I hope that in the timeline, we include a date to provide the final report for board review and comment. And that's just because in a statute that's been interpreted to strip boards of almost all their powers, that is the one power that is clearly written in the statute under 706. And my understanding from Donna Russo Savage's comments is that her reading of the statute is also that boards are entitled to get a look and an opportunity to review and seek counsel on the final report. Next, I would suggest, and I wonder if you could form a formal subcommittee to communicate with council and then keep minutes. So many of us are so thankful that you're here speaking to us, because all of the information that we've had has been filtered through various people. And I think it would benefit the public and an open process if you had a subcommittee that was voted on by the subcommittee, by the study committee, and then minutes be kept of what questions are put to you and how you answer them, and those minutes shared with the committee, and maybe even posted online. I think it would make all of us feel better, and we'd be much better informed if we could do that. Then, my other suggestion is the provision that calls for the warning articles says that the warning articles have to be substantially this, and listed all the essentials. In my view, that's a bare minimum. And couldn't this study committee, if it really cared about certain articles not being amended easily, ask to have those put in the warning? That's one way to ensure that the unified board doesn't touch something that has been carefully negotiated and thought about by this committee, and that is in there because all of our communities care about it. That's just something I put to everyone.
Anyone else?
Well, I'll just say a really brief thing, if I may, Alice. I would just like you to relate to Chris that his reputation does precede him, and he is very, very well informed and extremely good explainer of things. And so if you would relay that to him, I'd appreciate it. Then the other thing would be...
This is silly.
The other thing is, I was a little surprised on Article 15 on the leadership councils, because it sort of seemed to me that Chris was saying that as written is probably the most agreeable in terms of the agency of education actually looking at our articles and saying, yes, this does fulfill all the criteria. And to hear that then it was going to be changed again surprised me a little bit. And so I'm not sure that was, I don't know where that was going to go.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything else before we? All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very much.
Thank you.
Is there a motion?
Before we go,
Yeah.
we usually do the agendas for next time, so.
I think we've got a, I think what I'm gonna do is ask everyone, what I sometimes do is ask everyone to send me questions. Because I know that you guys have a lot of questions regarding the topics from tonight. Does that work? Because I
It's
think.
not for Chris necessarily, but it's Frank.
Yeah, I think, I know you all often have financial questions, so why don't you shoot those to me and then we can talk about how many of them, what we want addressed at the next meeting. All right?
If I could just mention,
Yeah.
because, you know, the way Chris put that in a context of generally has never been done before, I'm guessing much of the questions around the Vernon issue are not something I'll be able to answer.
Yeah.
So it's either Chris's advice or maybe a reference to another. So I'm anticipating that, so just
I
be,
know, I'll still send it.
yeah.
Okay. Is there a motion?
I move we adjourn.
A second?
So be it.
Any discussion about that? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you, everyone.
There's plenty of food over there, please help yourselves. Sandwiches, cookies, things like that. I came a little late and I apologize.
Oh, it's good. Thank you.